Hey, I'm Dave Prouse. Let's install Fedora Server 32. I'm using VirtualBox for this installation, and this time I'm running VirtualBox on Linux. You can grab VirtualBox from virtualbox.org/wiki/downloads for a variety of platforms, including Linux. If we click on Linux distributions, you'll see all the distributions there, from Ubuntu down to Debian, down to Fedora, and so on. I'm on Debian 10, so whichever one you're using, you would click that and you would grab it. If you hover on one, you'll see the name of the file on the bottom, and you can see it's VirtualBox 6.1, etc., etc. .deb. I've already downloaded that and installed it, but the install is really easy. Once you download it to your downloads folder in Linux, this is. If you take a look, I've downloaded it here. You can copy that and then do an apt install / and paste it in. And the install is really easy. But again, I've already done that. So to run it, we can just type VirtualBox or run the program from the programs location. And here we are. Welcome to VirtualBox. Brand new installation, so I'm going to have to do some configurations for it in order to make any virtual machines work. But first, we've got to grab Fedora Server. And you can do that from getfedora.org/en/server/download. And for this, I'm doing the net install, I believe. But you could do the standard install also if you want. If you have a slower internet connection and you don't want to have to rely on the internet during the installation. So whichever way you want to do that, as long as you're getting Fedora Server 32, that's what you want. And most likely you're using x86_64 architecture. But if you are using this, that's going to be what you're going to get. But for most people watching this, you're going to be getting one of these. Okay, I've already downloaded that to speed things up a little bit. So let's create a virtual machine in VirtualBox. I go through a lot of VirtualBox configuration in the Debian server installation, which is earlier in the main post for building Linux servers. But we'll do a quick setup here. We'll go to Machine and New, and we'll type the name. We're going to be using this server as an IPA server during the webinar. So I want to call this fed.ipa. Fed-IPA. I'm going to store it in the, actually, I'm going to change that. I am going to change that to my NVMe drive and create a new folder. And we'll just call this VirtualBox. Okay. And let's add a slash on there for Fed-IPA. If you're doing this on Windows, your paths and everything are obviously going to be a little bit different. Select wherever you want to store it. If you're not sure, do it in the default location. And when I put Fed in there, it says, hey, what are you installing? Linux? Fedora? 64-bit? Yes, I am. So that's what we want. And make sure you are selecting 64-bit. 32-bit will give you some trouble during the rest of this lab and also the webinar. So it's got to be Fedora 64-bit. We'll click Next for that. And then it says select the amount of RAM. You can get away with 1024, but if you can do more, go for it. I'm going to go for 4096 or 4 gigabytes of RAM. Click Next. Create a virtual hard disk now. Yes, we want to. Recommended size is 8 gig. I might go a little bigger because IPA can take up some space. So we'll click Create for that. We'll use the standard VDI for VirtualBox for the hard disk image. And we're saying dynamically allocated, meaning it only use what it needs to up to the maximum size that we select. So we'll leave it as dynamically allocated. Click Next. But I'm going to increase that size. I'm going to go with a 20 gig. You could probably get away with 8, but I would say go with at least 12 or more gig for this Fedora server installation. If you could do 20, go for 20. So I'm going to create that now. And it is there, fed-IPA. We're good to go. So now we have a couple things to do. We have to configure the storage option, the ISO image, and also the networking. So we'll right-click on that and go to Settings. Okay, first is storage, and we need to set the disk image. So we'll click on that, and then we'll select here on the disk icon, and we'll go to choose a disk file. Mine are in ISOs, so wherever you have yours, that's what you're going to want to grab. Here's my Fedora Server Net installation. That's the one I downloaded, and this type of installation, the network installation, will grab a lot of files from the internet during the install. So you could go for the standard if you want to, again, if you have a slower internet connection. Download it while you're doing other stuff, then you could do the install and not have to wait for the install to be pulling down more information from the internet. But my internet connection is pretty quick, usually, so I'm going to choose this guy and click Open. And that is now set up as the storage device for the disk image. Okay, the next thing is the network. And by default, VirtualBox will set you up as network address translation, which is great for one virtual machine. The virtual machine will be able to get out to the internet, and it'll be behind that NAT network. But if you create additional virtual machines in this manner, they will not be able to communicate with each other. And we want that for this webinar. And generally, you want that. So you have to select NAT network. The problem is we don't have one created yet. And if you do a stock installation of VirtualBox, by default, there won't be one. So we have to go ahead and create that and then select it. I'm going to click OK for this for now, and we're going to create that NAT network. So we'll go to File, Preferences, go to Network, and you can see NAT networks. There are none here. We need a NAT network for multiple VMs to communicate with each other. So I'm going to click the plus sign, and I'm just going to stick with that default one that it creates for us, and it automatically puts it on the 10.0.2.0 network. That's it. Click OK. Then we can go back to the settings for that virtual machine and modify that network attached to setting to NAT network, and now it has one, the one we just created. Click OK for that, and now we should be ready to roll. Let's double click on the virtual machine to start up the installation. And I actually didn't select this properly during the configuration there. You have to make sure that you have the Fedora server ISO image selected. And if you didn't do it during the settings portion, then you can do it here. And we'll click Start. There we go. And it's starting the install. Okay. And so you can test this or just install it. This is the install option. So I'm going to press Enter for that to start the install up. We're getting some video stuff here. It's getting a little bit quirky. Little bit quirky. OBS is recording a little bit quirky. Let's see if this gets fixed. Okay, all I did was I maximized the screen in VirtualBox. I did that with a Control-C. I think we're okay now as far as the video goes. I'm monitoring that as we record here, but I think we're good. So now we're into Fedora 32. Now we're doing this as a graphic installation, but we're just going to be installing a server as command line only. So keep that in mind. I'm selecting English United States. You can modify that if you wish, but that's my default, and I'm going to select that and continue. Depending on the speed of your computer, that might go a little bit slow, so you have to be ready for that. Now we have an installation summary. We have to do some work here, and we have to grab some information as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is change this, the installation destination. Okay, there's an exclamation point there. We're going to click on that, but we're just going to leave it as the entire 20 gigabyte or whatever size you selected, the entire partition, that entire drive, and just click done. That'll save the configuration, check it, and it's good. The installation source after a little bit should go to the closest mirror to you automatically. And then software selection. Well, it says Fedora Server Edition. If we click on that, you'll see that is the third option here. And that is what I want. It's an integrated, easier to manage server. No GUI though, right? So we want to make sure we have no GUI here. We don't want KDE or any of these. We want to make sure we are using just Fedora Server Edition, no GUI, command line interface only, otherwise known as console only. So we'll click done for that. And that's really just going to leave it as is. Normally, you also have to change the time of date. Quite often, it'll show Los Angeles. I'm in the New York time zone, so I'm going to select that and click done. And then I'm going to set a root password right now. If you do set one, well, you should set one because that's what we're going to be using in the labs. Make sure you jot down what it is. Go with a strong password. Okay, and we'll click done for that. Finally, we have the network and host name. We'll click on that now. And you can see that it's already gotten an IP address. That's done through the NAT network on VirtualBox. It gave it 10.0.2.4. And it sees the default route, the gateway, as 10.0.2.1. And I'm going to be modifying this later, either later in this video or during the webinar, also to 10.0.2.1. So this should work for now. This is dynamically assigned, and maybe I'll reconfigure that to static. If you wanted to, you'd go to configure here, then you go to IP version 4 settings and change it from automatic to manual, and then set all your settings there now. I'm not going to do that right now. I'm going to leave that, and I'm going to modify that later with the nmcli command. But I do want to change the host name now. This computer is going to be fed-ipa.example.com. fed-ipa.example.com. Apply that. Click done here. And also, by the way, check this on-off switch. Make sure it's on, and you see the blue here, and make sure it does say connected. Sometimes this is off if you're using CentOS or another system, so you want to check that. Otherwise, it won't boot with the network connection automatically every time. So you turn that on now, and then click done. That's it. We've created our... Well, we've set everything up here, and you know what? I'm sorry, that's not it. We want to make a user as well. We're going to go to user creation, and we're just going to use the name user, because that's how we're going to SSH in. Then we elevate to root. So I'm going to give that a complex password, which is different from my root password. Whatever you choose, type it twice, and then write it down, jot it down in your notes in case you think you'll forget. Okay, and we'll click done for that. All right, now everything is configured, and we can begin the installation. All right, so now we can go ahead and just let this install and give it several minutes to finish, depending on the speed of your computer. And I'm going to pause the video and be back in a little bit. You'll notice here 629 RPMs have to be downloaded, an additional 400 megabytes. So again, that's another reason to choose the standard installation if you think you don't want to sit around during an installation forever. Just do your download of the full-blown ISO from the beginning, and you can do other things while that's downloading. Of course, you could do other things while this is happening as well. So it all depends on the speed of your internet connection, though. If you do not have broadband, I would definitely go with the standard ISO and just let that download overnight or something. Then the next day you could do the install a lot quicker. All right, so I'm going to pause the video here. I'll be back in a little bit when this is complete. Okay, installation is complete. Great job. Let's reboot. Give that a moment to reboot here in VirtualBox. Okay, and we have our option here, Fedora 32. It's using Linux kernel 5.6. It's already booting. And that should bring us to the login screen. Okay, so that took a moment to get this running. Sometimes Fedora can have a couple issues with VirtualBox. You might have to do a restart of the virtual machine. But we are here now in the login screen. So I'm going to connect as root and type in my root password. And we're in. We're good to go here. I'm going to run we're going to run an nmcli to take a look at our networking. And so it appears that the networking is good, but we're going to make it better. We can test it just to make sure that we can connect to the internet, and we can. So that's good. But I'm going to do a couple things here. First thing, real quick, I'm going to modify Grub so that we can see the screen a little bit better. Let's see if I can fix that up a little bit. We're going to do a vim might not actually be installed. And this is going to look for updates, so I'm just going to pause the recording while it's doing so. Okay, so you should actually check for updates for Fedora server as well. But here we have Vim, so I'm going to install that now. You don't have to use Vim. You can use Nano if you want. But I just am more comfortable in Vim. Okay, that's finished. So now I want to modify that grub file so I can change the resolution. So we'll do a vim/etc/default/grub and press enter. And we're going to make some modifications here and additions. So first line, grub _ cmd line _ Linux _ default equals no mode set, close quote, and we're going to add grub _ gfx payload _ Linux equals 1280 by 720. And check this. Both lines look okay. Escape out, save it. And to make those changes take effect, we're going to do a grub2 mk config. There we go. And we can reboot that to take effect. Also, if you want to modify the fonts, you would have to install console setup here. You could do that with the DNF install console setup. And once you're done with that, you can modify those fonts at etc/default/console setup and modify them in the configuration file. Let's reboot first. Okay, so this looks a little bit better. I'm not going to bother to modify the fonts. I showed you how to do it, and that's in the text in the documentation as well. But this is good enough for now. Looks good to me. So a couple changes I want to make here. First of all, it's basically networking changes, but I want to check a couple things. I want to make sure my host name is correct, and it is fed-ipa.example.com. Then I want to change the IP configuration. Now, if we do an nmcli, you'll see that the inet4 address is 10.0.2.4/24. That's what was given to me by VirtualBox, by the NAT network. I want to change that to a static address. I'm going to use the same IP, but I'm just going to be using it manually. So I have to configure that manually. Because generally, with the servers I work with, they should be configured in a static fashion. Now down below where it says DNS configuration, it says server. For me, it's 172.21.0.1. That's my LAN 172.21 network. I'm going to change that to 10.0.2.1, which is the gateway and default address for VirtualBox's NAT network. So, and also if you look at the top, the name of the adapter is ENP0S3. So you're going to have to jot down whatever that is so you can use that information to modify our network connection. So I'm going to use the nmcli command, actually nmcli, and you would do a connection modify, or you can abbreviate that to conmod, and then you have to put in the name of the adapter. ENP for me, 0S3. For you, it might be different, but for me, it's ENP0S3, and then apply the configuration. So I want a static configuration, so I have to set everything here. And you can also go into the interactive editor with nmcli if you wish. I just like to do it all in one line. So I'm going to do IP version 4.address and specify that address that I want, which is just the same address that we have already, 10.0.2.4. That may be different for you. It most likely will be different. If you're installing this to VirtualBox, it'll be 10.0.2. something by default, unless you've selected a different network for your NAT network. If you're on if you're on VMware Workstation, it'll be 192.168.185 or something of that nature. If you're doing this in a bridged manner, which I don't really recommend for the webinar, it could be whatever you've selected. But for me, it's 10.0.2.4/24. Make sure you put in the slash in there so the net mask is included. Very important so it can communicate properly with the other virtual machines that we're working with in the webinar. Then IP version 4.gateway, which is 10.0.2.1. Then IP version 4.DNS. That we're changing. Right now, for me, it's 172.21.0.1. I want 10.0.2.1. Same IP address as the gateway. And finally, IP version 4.method. What's the method? We're configuring this statically. We don't want DHCP. So I'm doing IP version 4.method space manual. We'll press enter. No news is good news. And we're not going to see that unless we down the adapter and up it again. We can do that with an nmcli con down ENP 0S3. I didn't type it correctly. I said EMP. That's ENP for me. There we go. Successfully deactivated. Up arrow back to it. And now we can just up it again to reactivate it. nmcli con up correctly. ENP 0S3. Press enter. And connection successfully activated. At this point, if we run an nmcli, our configuration should have taken hold. And we see here 10.0.2.4. But if we look below, you can see the DNS configuration, 10.0.2.1. That's what we want. Now we have to check it. Check that with a quick ping to example.com. And we're good. So you may say, well, how come VirtualBox picks the external DNS server on your LAN automatically? That's just how VirtualBox is set up. I don't want that, though. I want it set to the VirtualBox configuration. And it doesn't really matter very much because that's all going to change in the webinar because we're going to be creating a DNS server, and that will be the IP address at that point, but not until we create it. As long as you can get access to the internet and ping things like Pong. No, we don't ping Pong, but try different internet addresses. If you're in another country, you may have to choose a couple different ones. Here's one of mine, serverbash.com, which works nicely. And I think just about everybody has access to it. And by the way, all this documentation is at Prouse.tech. There it is. On DreamHost, running on Apache. Yes. I like Apache. I also like NGINX, but whatever, getting on a tangent here. Let's get back on track. I believe everything is just about configured. We've got a nice resolution here, but we're going to be SSHing into this guy during the webinar. So you want to make sure you can SSH in. That's important. So to do that, you're going to have to go to VirtualBox and create a port forwarding rule. That is if you're using VirtualBox. I show this in a separate video in the Debian installation. So if you've watched that video, you've already seen how to do this, but there's also step-by-step instructions on how to do that in the documentation. All right, but otherwise, I think we're all configured. We've got the static IP. You can also check your default gateway with an IP route show and make sure we're using 10.0.2.1. But otherwise, NMCLI is showing us the rest of the information here. So that's all configured. Hostname is set up. We should be good to go. And during the webinar, we'll use this system to install and configure and work with IPA, free IPA server. So I'm going to shut down this now. And the place you would go in VirtualBox to configure the port forwarding, you would go to File, Preferences, go to Network, select your NAT network, double-click it, and then go down to Port Forwarding. And this is where you would add that rule. And again, that is shown in the documentation. This is the end of the video, so I'll just show it real quick. Click the plus sign for a new rule. We'll call it SSH. Because without some type of routing or port forwarding, you can't connect via SSH to the internal NAT network virtual machines and VirtualBox from your main system. It cannot be done. You got to have some type of routing set up, or this port forwarding trick that I'm going to show you. I'm going to set it up as TCP, and we're going to use the local host IP address, 127.0.0.1. The host port, I use 2222 generally to start in VirtualBox. So 2222. Then the guest IP, you have to know what that is. For me, that was 10.0.2.4. The guest port is going to be the default SSH port, which is 22. So this is a little trick where you're going through your local host and out through your main system to this IP on this port. So a little port forwarding trick. And in fact, I guess we can show this. I'll show how to do it real quick. Click OK for that rule, click OK, and click OK. And then generally what I like to do is close out of VirtualBox just to make sure that takes effect. And we'll open VirtualBox back up. There we go. Double click on Fed IPA to bring that back up. And generally you want to shut down machines, but we probably wouldn't have had to do that. We could have probably just let the virtual machine run, but it is on now and we're at the login screen. I'm going to get out of here and open up another command line and SSH in. And I'm doing this from my main Linux system, my main workstation. So I'm going to run SSH. And you want to pick a user account that's on that virtual machine. Well, we created user. So we'll use that user, but here's the trick. You do user at and the local computer address, the actual physical computer local host, 127.0.0.1. Then you have to specify the port with a -P, and we'll do that with 2222. That's the port we selected. That might not work for me because I might be using that somewhere else. We'll check that in a minute. Press enter. Oh, no, we're good. I'm sorry, not a problem, because that was a brand new installation of VirtualBox on this computer. Okay, so I'm going to say yes to accept the fingerprint, and then it needs the password of the user account on that Fedora server. So whatever password you selected for the user account during the installation, that's what we're going to type in, and we're in. And it shows you also you can use a web console, that's cockpit, at HTTPS, the name of the computer or IP address, and port 9090. It shows you the IP here as well. But we're in. I'm set up as user. And that's what you're going to want to do in the webinar. And when working with the server, this way we can cut and paste information, say, from the internet. You know, let's say we're on a web page and we want to cut and paste information that we have here from whatever syntax or what have you. We can easily copy and paste that to our SSH session. Can't do that if you're working directly in a virtual machine. So that's one of the reasons to do this. But we're also going to want to be working as root. So we can do that with the su space dash and type in the password of the root account. And now we are in. I'm set up as root at fed-IPA. And you can see I just did an NMCLI. All good here. Like I say, if you have time, do a DNF update. And also you may want to install a couple programs. If you have some time to do that, we'll do a DNF install. And we already did Vim, but you're also going to want curl and git generally when working with these virtual machines. So if you have time, you can do that as well. But just make sure that you can SSH in and that you've got the name configured and you've got the IP configuration set up and the DNS. So we're all good here. And I'm going to shut down the server and get out. See you at the next video.